Boy, we could clearly have done a good half hour with that kind of music. I mean, thank you so much, TL, and thank you, Jerry. Have yourself a little breakfast now. Our main event is here. Mr. Tufuku Zuburi, welcome to Live from the Heartland, man.
Thank you very much. I am happy to be here.
You were here once before, right?
I was. Me and Michael were hanging out, shooting an episode of The History Detectives, trying to talk about that revolution he was trying to make back when. And I hope he's still trying to make it. Where he at? He out someplace making
He is actually down on the border of Texas and Mexico, doing what he does every Father's Day weekend for many years now, which is basketball in the barrio. Playing basketball with the young kids of both sides of the border and trying to do a little Athletes United peace action down there. So we say a big hello to Michael, and at least one of his kids is down there, and that was his eldest, Jesse James. So in fact, I could not believe how many people commented on that show you did. A lot of people heard of it, saw it.
Yes.
And you did it so well.
Yeah, it was one of our more popular shows. I mean, the very idea of engaging in social protests to make the world better has become a little more distant from us right now.
You think?
Yeah, but that was a time where people actually stood up to change their world. They cared enough to do something.
Yeah.
They cared enough to step out of line and do something. Do we got some people out there to do that today?
We do. I mean, we've got a lot of people in this neighborhood anyway. We've got the whole Rogers Park Occupy Rogers Park group, who are consistently doing, quietly but steadily, consistently doing good things.
And that's what it takes.
It does.
It takes the courage and the motivation to do that kind of thing. So that was a good episode because it basically presented that aspect of America's history. And that is a legacy which goes all the way back to those people who fought for independence, those people who fought to destroy enslavement, those folks who fought to destroy Jim Crow, trying always to increasingly give the people more and more power.
And that leads right into what this incredible project of yours. First of all, where do you get off at saying, I'm going to make a 2-hour movie about African independence? I mean, it's a big continent, dude.
It is a big continent,
but you did it.
I did do it. Because the question is, people do not know about African independence. You ask somebody, you say, do you know about African independence? And they will tell you, I didn't even know Africa had independence. Independence from what?
Right.
And what does that mean? Because typically, all people know about Africa, disease, war, corruption, all this negative stuff. What positive are they saying about Africa? Not the African animals, not the African landscape,
safari,
but the African people.
Right.
What positive are they saying?
Right. Well, oddly enough, and we just mentioned this on a recent show, when I was coming up and going to college, which I was lucky enough to do, we had our sights set, and we did a lot of travel and study in Latin and South America. This generation, my nieces, 2 of my nieces have been to Africa.
Yeah.
One of them for a year.
Yeah.
And both of them for extended periods, like the kind of time I spent in Mexico when I was a student.
Yeah.
So the younger generation seems to be making their way to Africa.
The younger generation is interested in Africa, but we still suffer from a lot of ignorance about Africa.
Absolutely.
So this project, which I started back in 2005, and I have made a number of trips for the filming of this project all over Africa. I've talked to freedom fighters. Some of those freedom fighters are still fighting for freedom. Some of those freedom fighters are now heads of state. Some of those freedom fighters are the main opposition in the state. But the thing that they wanted to do was liberate Africa from colonial regimes which had dominated them for, tens and sometimes hundreds of years. And so what this film is about is actually the most important thing to happen on the African continent in the 20th century.
And it all happened in the 20th century.
It all happened in the 20th century.
Right.
I mean, it ended with the last independent state, and this was with South Africa in its fight against apartheid. So that was 1994. Now, there's a lot of internal struggle and civil strife,
right,
which sometimes has given rise to new states, as you saw in the Sudan. But primarily the struggle against European colonialism, which was the fight of African independence, culminated in 1994 with the independence of South Africa. And some people get mad with that because they say South Africa was independent before that. Well, independent from the tyranny which starts with European colonialism.
Right. Now, I think, if I remember correctly, I read this, that for the film, the African independence, which is, by the way, showing right now at Facets Multimedia as part of the Africans in Diaspora.
It's the African Diaspora International Film Festival. It will screen again on the 18th at 6 o'clock p.m.
Oh, so it's not there tonight?
It's not there tonight.
Because
it will screen again.
Films,
it was screened last night, and it'll screen again on the 18th at 6 o'clock, at 6 p.m. However, there are a number of wonderful films that will be screened between now and the 20th.
Yeah.
And they cover the entire African diaspora. Some stuff you won't see on television, you won't see in your theater, but you can support those films by coming out.
Amen.
And give those people some support.
It's our great good fortune in Chicago to have a festival like this. There are many times across the year that we are pointing things like this out that are small but mighty.
Small but mighty. And this is the 11th year that they've had the festival here in Chicago.
Yeah.
The important thing about this festival too is they have the festival in they have had it the festival in Paris, in New York, in Washington D.C., and in the Caribbean, and here we are now in Chicago. But this is the 11th year of the festival in Chicago.
That's way cool.
Yeah.
Now, is home for you Pennsylvania?
Home for me is Philadelphia.
Okay.
I've lived in Philadelphia now for about 27 years. I was originally born in Oakland, California. One of the very important cities in America. If you want to understand the nature of how people have worked hard to redefine what it means to be a human being in this country. And as humans, it is our responsibility to define who we are and what we are. You don't just get that in school. You definitely don't wait for a politician to tell you it. It is something you have to engage in reinventing. And that is the tradition I come out of. So that's how I end up making a film on African independence, is because that same struggle, the Black Panther Party, the Civil Rights Movement, that very same struggle, SDS, that very same struggle, that is the struggle of African independence. That is the struggle that gives the people more freedom and allows them to take advantage of their creativity to change the world, to make the world a better place.
Woo! Speak. Indeed. Well, if I got it correctly, there were I think 4 periods that you were sort of framework of your picture, and I think the first one was the slave trade.
Well, so basically, we give a brief background to the film by talking about what put Africa in the situation that it needed to be independent from.
I want to hear that because I missed the first 4 minutes of the film.
Yes. So the first 4 minutes, that's what the first 4 minutes of the film is about. What is it? What are you talking about? African independence from what?
Right.
So first you had this tragic event of Africa experiencing the slave trade, which is where Africans were ripped out of Africa and served the material basis, the labor that financed modern society.
Right.
But the tens of millions, not 10 million, tens of millions of Africans who were ripped from the African continent, most dying on the bottom of the Atlantic Ocean and then ending up in the United States, in Brazil, in Jamaica, in all of these places. But you got to think, where were they ripped out of, and what did they do to the African continent?
Right.
No sooner had the slave trade ended that the European colonial powers came and dragged Africa down again. And this was to make African societies feed the engine to feed the societies of Europe. So they ripped those countries off. So now we enter that space, that moment, and that's when we cover 4 watershed events. And those watershed events are World War II,
Right.
the independence movement in Africa, the Cold War, and this new period where these African republics are finally taking off. See, people look at Africa the wrong way. If you want to look at Africa, imagine looking at the United States 50 years after its independence. Now, imagine me looking at the United States 50 years after its independence. I'm looking at the United States, I'm like, that's a barbaric society.
Right.
They got all those people enslaved.
Right.
They don't even let women vote. These people gotta be crazy. If you poor, you cannot even vote. That's the United States 50 years after independence. So now I'm looking at Africa 50 years after independence, and I see hope. I see beauty. I see people using their energies to make it a better place.
Wow.
And I'm talking about the Africans doing that. I'm not talking about the aid that's coming from the U.S., coming from the UN. I'm not talking about the debt that's coming from the World Bank, coming from the International Monetary Fund. I'm not talking about the grants that are there to cure this disease or that disease. I'm talking about the efforts of the African people to create a better world. And they are doing that. Their problems? Of course they got problems. Yet they're engaged in making the solutions to those problems, and that's what this film is about.
Sigh. You really did teach. I mean, that film with the interspersing of the African continent map, showing us, all the various countries. For example, I learned, one of the things I learned, the Frontline states.
Yes.
Talk about the Frontline states, because that seems to be the beginning, the cutting edge of post-colonial dealings.
The frontline states are those countries which were on the African continent engaged in warfare with the apartheid government of South Africa. Because you got to understand, Mandela was in jail for a reason, and all of his comrades were in jail for reasons,
right.
And many of them were in exile for reasons. What were those reasons? The South African government wanted to destroy their movement for independence. In 1961, a reporter asked Nelson Mandela, as soon as he went into hiding, before he was arrested, he said, "What are you all fighting for?" And Nelson Mandela said, "We are fighting for freedom. We are fighting for political freedom. In this country, we do not have political freedom.
Right.
We are fighting," his words, "for political independence." So that political independence doesn't occur until 1994. So the frontline states were right there with the African National Congress, the Pan-African Congress, the Black Consciousness Movement, Steve Biko, all of these heroes of the South African independence movement had the support of countries like Tanzania, Zambia, and these countries were strategically important, and because they facilitated the independence of Angola, the independence of Mozambique. Right. And see, people don't usually talk about that. What they want to talk about is the other people who helped. Of course the Cubans helped. They helped a tremendous amount. Of course the Chinese helped. They helped a tremendous amount. And so did the Russians. We got to give them their props. You might hate on them for their communism, but you got to give them their props for supporting the independence of Africa.
For communism.
Okay, all right. Well, let's get rid of it then.
basically.
I
We
hear
generally don't even get involved in that
Well,
stuff.
some people do, but I'm just saying
Yeah.
these places helped foster
Right.
the independence on the African continent. Because it's just like, can you imagine, you go on a slave plantation, and you ask the slaves, well, how y'all doing? And some of the slaves would say, we doing all
fine,
right.
thank you.
We doing fine, yes. But as Harriet Tubman said, she said she would have freed twice as many people if they would have known they were slaves. So if you would have landed in Africa during the period of colonialism, yeah, you might have found a few people who said, no, things are all right. But you found a whole bunch more people said, we need to end this because we need freedom. Why aren't we making the money from the labor of from our labor?
And from your own natural resources.
And our own national resources. Why are they going to the rest of the world, feeding the beast of industrialization, feeding all of the processes that became modern capitalism? So the film tries to dig into what does this mean for Africa, and why is this more important than the aid?
So what does it mean for Africa?
Well, what it means for Africa is that it gave Africans the power to talk about where their future goes.
Yeah.
It put it in the hands of the people. And that's really important because sometimes we forget if people are second-class citizens, that means they don't fully participate in making the decisions that dictate their life. So imagine you got a president and you can't vote for him. You got a senator and you can't vote for him.
Right.
Imagine that the mayor for your city, they send him over from London. And he sits there in his wool suit,
right,
and determines policies that will rule your life. This is what the end of colonial rule meant for Africa. And the end of colonial rule was a result of African sweat. That's why I say it's the most important thing to happen on the African continent in the 20th century, because it is something that came out of the African desire for freedom, justice, and equality.
Okay, there's an incredibly cool moment in the film that you include, and that's when Nelson Mandela is standing at a podium right next to the first President Bush. That was a great clip to include.
Yes.
Because literally, Bush gives his version of the world, and Nelson Mandela, dignified, respectful, corrects him. Says, well, somebody didn't brief you correctly.
Absolutely.
Oh my God!
And he needed to be.
I would have given anything to see that live. To have someone, to have Nelson Mandela in all his glory, standing there next to that guy, and saying politely, "You've been misinformed."
And
basically,
what he was talking about points to why the frontline states were so important. Because they were engaged in violent revolution.
Yeah.
It was a violent revolution in Mozambique. It was a violent armed conflict in Angola. Mm-hmm. And it was a violent armed conflict in South Africa.
Right.
South Africa's victory wasn't just from the protest in the streets. They were blowing things up. They were engaged in armed conflict with the South African government. And so, Bush gonna sit there and say, well, we want you all to put the gun down. You don't want us to put the gun down. These people are killing us. And they've been doing it for hundreds of years. Right. So the reason the frontline states were so important is because they took on the might of not only the South African government, but the support the South African government received from the British government, from the United States of America, fighting to maintain apartheid in South Africa. So the frontline states gave military support, they gave training to the South Africans fighting.
They gave moral support.
And they set up bases in their country, which got bombed by the South African government, often with the support, tactical and politically, from the United States government.
And by the time, just before independence really hit, by the time that happened, you also had movement all over the world.
All over
with
the world.
Young people especially. I remember here, there was a movement to divest
yes.
of the investiture in South Africa.
Investment in South
Quit
Africa.
supporting the apartheid government.
That's
and
right.
that was a very strong movement across the U.S., mostly on college campuses.
College campuses, Washington, D.C.,
Yeah.
New York, London, Paris, Tokyo. This was an international movement
Absolutely.
to bring down the beast of apartheid.
Yeah.
So, you know, what happened is that the world stood up and they saw that this was simply wrong. Why are these people engaged in an armed struggle against their own government in South Africa? Because of the racial injustices, the racial intolerance. It was untenable, and people weren't going to stand for it. So people around the world saw that basically the governments were supporting the South African government. And so the people began to support the African National Congress, the Pan-African Congress, the Black Consciousness Movement. And so the people's power went behind the protest against it, and guess what? The people won.
I'm going to pull a Jon Stewart and say we're going to go a little longer here on our video because I think we need a little more time. But right now we're also going to thank the listening audience for listening, and tune in again next week. And every week at 9 a.m. we're here doing good things, asking for people to tell us how to change the world. And we do say power to the people. So I'm going to continue talking here with Tukufu. I do that every time. Tukufu.
You got it, baby.
All right, take us out.